The mountains rose like broken teeth against a Balkan sky that couldn't decide between gray and something darker. November wind cut through the valley with the kind of cold that found every gap in your gear, every weakness in your resolve. It was the kind of morning that made men question why they'd chosen this life. But the 8 Navy SEALs crouched on the rocky outcrop weren't questioning their choices. They were questioning their calculations. 3 hours, 37 rounds, 0 hits. Master Chief Daniel Cross lowered his spotting scope and rubbed eyes that burned from too much focus, too little success. 18 years in the teams had taught him patience. 18 years had taught him that some shots were harder than others. But 18 years had not prepared him for a valley that seemed to have a personal vendetta against every bullet they sent across it. 2,387 meters, 1.48 miles of air that moved like something alive. Wind that changed direction 3 times during a bullet's flight. Temperature gradients that shifted every 10 minutes. Atmospheric conditions that made their best technology look like expensive paperweights. Behind Cross, Gunnery Sergeant William Briggs stood with his arms crossed, watching the SEAL snipers with the kind of expression that said everything without saying anything. At 68 years old, Briggs had seen wars that most of these men had only read about in history books. Vietnam, Beirut, the First Gulf War. His face was a roadmap of service, deeply lined, weathered by decades of wind and sun, and the particular kind of aging that came from looking through rifle scopes at other human beings in making difficult decisions. They'd brought Briggs in as a civilian contractor 3 days ago. Naval Special Warfare Command had a problem, and when conventional solutions failed, they reached back into the roster of legends. Briggs was a legend. 247 confirmed kills across 5 decades of service. The Marine Corps had built its modern scout sniper program on fieldcraft techniques that Briggs had pioneered in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But legend status didn't pay the mortgage. So at 68, when most men his age were playing golf or bouncing grandchildren on their knees, Briggs was standing on a frozen mountainside in the Balkans, watching a new generation struggle with a problem that looked familiar but felt impossible. Chief Marcus Webb moved into position beside Cross, adjusting the Barrett M82A1 rifle that weighed as much as a small child. Webb was 36, African-American, father of 3, and one of the finest shots in naval special warfare. His service record showed kills at ranges exceeding 1,800 meters in Iraq. His eyes showed something else: frustration. "Wind's doing that thing again," Webb said quietly. His voice carried the kind of calm that came from understanding that panic solved nothing. "Kestrel says 4 miles per hour left to right at our position. But watch the trees at 1,200 meters. Cross lifted his spotting scope again. The trees Webb indicated were bending in the opposite direction, right to left, maybe 7 miles per hour, which meant somewhere between their position and those trees, the wind was doing something complicated, something their instruments couldn't fully measure. "Thermal layer," Briggs said from behind them. His voice was gravelly, roughened by decades of cigarettes he'd quit 20 years too late. "Rising air from the valley floor hits the cold air coming down from the peaks, creates a boundary. Wind does different things on each side of it." Webb looked back at the old Marine. "Gunny, we've got atmospheric data from 3 different Kestrel stations at different elevations. We've got laser rangefinders accurate to within a meter. We've got ballistic computers that can calculate Coriolis effect, spin drift, everything, and we're still missing." Briggs unfolded his arms and walked forward. His movements were deliberate, careful. Age had taken some of the spring from his step, but none of the authority. He moved like a man who'd earned every scar, every gray hair, every painful morning joint. "Son," Briggs said, coming to stand beside Webb, "I was making kills before those computers were invented. You know what we used? Eyes, brain, and the understanding that wind isn't data. Wind is a living thing. It breathes, it shifts, it plays games with you." Petty Officer Tyler Kane was 24 years old and looked like someone who'd stepped out of a recruiting poster. Athletic, confident, and currently annoyed. He'd been at the rifle for the last 40 minutes, sending round after expensive round downrange into nothing but mountain air. "With all due respect, Gunny," Kane said, not quite keeping the edge out of his voice, "that old school Kentucky windage stuff might have worked in Vietnam. But we're shooting almost 1.5 miles. At that range, we need precision. We need technology." Briggs looked at Kane with the kind of expression that seasoned NCOs reserve for young men who knew just enough to be dangerous. How many confirmed combat kills you got, son? Kane's jaw tightened. I'm working on my first. Then maybe spend less time talking about what works and more time learning from people who've been doing this since before you were born. Briggs's tone wasn't cruel. It was matter of fact. The kind of correction that stung because it was true. Cross intervened before the tension could escalate. Gunny's right. We're missing something fundamental here. The question is what? The target was visible through high-powered optics. A warlord whose activities had destabilized 3 countries and killed enough civilians to earn him a priority slot on every international wanted list. Intelligence had finally pinpointed his location in the fortified compound across the valley. He appeared periodically, moving between buildings, talking to security personnel, completely unaware that 8 of America's finest were trying very hard to end his existence. But the valley protected him. The valley with its impossible wind patterns, and its thermal layers, and its atmospheric chaos that turned every shot into a gamble. Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison was 28, lean, intense, and currently studying data on a tablet like it held the secrets of the universe. He'd been an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Scout Sniper Course before joining the teams. If anyone could solve this problem with math, it was Morrison. Sir, Morrison said to Cross, I've been analyzing our shot data. We're seeing consistent deviation patterns. Every round is missing high and to one side or low and to the other. Like something's pushing the bullets in a specific direction, but we can't identify the source. Briggs had moved to the edge of the outcrop, standing where he could see the full sweep of the valley. He wasn't looking through optics. He was just looking, observing, reading terrain the way other men read newspapers. It's not one thing pushing your bullets, Briggs said without turning around. It's 3 things, 4 maybe. You've got the wind at our elevation. You've got the wind at valley floor. You've got thermal currents rising because that compound sits on south-facing slope that's getting sun while we're in shadow. And you've got the Venturi effect where the valley narrows at 1,500 meters, which accelerates air through that gap like water through a funnel. Webb walked over to stand beside Briggs. How can you see all that without instruments? Briggs pointed. See those birds circling at 2,000 meters? They're riding an updraft, means warm air rising strong enough to lift their weight. See that dust on the road near the compound? It's swirling counterclockwise. Means wind at ground level is doing something different than wind at altitude. See those clouds moving east to west while the trees are bending west to east? Means you've got wind shear, different speeds at different heights. Webb stared at the valley trying to see what Briggs saw. After a moment, he shook his head. I see the birds in the dust, but I don't see how that translates into a shooting solution. Because you're looking for data, Briggs said. I'm looking for truth. Data tells you what things are doing right now. Truth tells you what they're about to do. Big difference at this range. Cross checked his watch. The target was scheduled to relocate in 5 hours. Intelligence was confident about that timeline. After 5 hours, this opportunity vanished, and weeks of operational planning went with it. We're running out of time, Cross said. We need to make this work. Suggestions? Kane was back at the rifle, dialing adjustments into the Schmidt and Bender scope that cost more than a luxury car. I say we compensate for everything Gunny's describing and take another shot. Multiple shots if necessary. Volume of fire increases probability of impact. Volume of fire also increases probability of revealing our position, Webb said. This isn't a machine gun range. Every round we send tells anyone paying attention where we are. Briggs turned away from the valley. You want my suggestion? Stop trying to force the shot. Wait for the valley to give you a window. A window? Morrison asked. Atmospheric conditions aren't constant chaos, Briggs said. They're rhythmic chaos. Patterns repeat. Not perfectly, but close enough. You watch long enough, you'll see moments when things align. When the wind at every elevation briefly stabilizes. When thermal layers settle. Those moments are rare, but they're real. You wait for one of those moments, then you shoot. Kane scoffed. So we just sit here and hope the universe decides to cooperate? No, Briggs said. You sit here and learn to read when the universe is cooperating. Then you take advantage. How long could that take? Kane asked. However long it takes. Lieutenant Commander Jack Harris climbed up to their position, moving with the careful balance of someone navigating loose rock. At 45, Harris was the task force leader, responsible for 8 shooters, 4 spotters, and a mission that was rapidly approaching failure. His face showed the strain. "Talk to me, Cross," Harris said. "JSOC is asking for progress reports. I'm running out of ways to say we're still trying." Cross pulled Harry aside, speaking quietly. "Sir, we're dealing with atmospheric conditions that are beyond what conventional shooting solutions can handle. Gunny thinks we need to wait for a stability window. Kane wants to keep sending rounds hoping for a lucky hit. Webb's on the fence. Morrison's still analyzing data." Harris looked over at Briggs, who had resumed his position at the valley's edge, watching like a patient hunter. "What do you think about Gunny's approach?" "I think," Cross said carefully, "that Gunny's made 247 confirmed kills using methods we don't fully understand. I think we've made 0 hits in 3 hours, using methods we trust completely. I think maybe it's time to try something different." Harris was silent for a moment. Command decisions were easy when the path was clear. This path was anything but clear. "Keep trying," Harris finally said, "but start incorporating Gunny's observations. We can't afford to dismiss any approach at this point." That's when they saw her. Dr. Sarah Hendricks had been with the task force for 3 weeks. ISA liaison, intelligence support activity. She coordinated information flow between various agencies, provided analytical support, and generally existed in the background doing work that nobody paid much attention to. She was 33, average height, athletic in the way that suggested regular PT, but nothing extraordinary. Brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, face that you might forget 5 minutes after meeting her. She perfected the art of being overlooked, but now she was walking toward the shooting position carrying a rifle case that looked heavy, and the expression on her face suggested someone who'd made a decision. Cross saw her first. "Dr. Hendricks, we're kind of in the middle of something." "I can see that," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried better than expected. "You've been in the middle of it for 3 hours, 37 shots, 0 impacts." Kane turned from the rifle, irritation plain on his face. "You keeping score, ma'am?" "I've been observing your technique and mapping atmospheric conditions since you started," Sarah said. She set the rifle case down with a solid thunk that suggested quality equipment. "Your ballistic calculations are using 2-dimensional models for a 3-dimensional fluid dynamics problem. That's why you're missing." There was a moment of absolute silence. 8 SEALs and 1 Marine gunny staring at the ISA liaison who just diagnosed their failure with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Webb spoke first, his tone careful. "Ma'am, with respect, our ballistic computers account for wind at multiple elevations, temperature gradients, barometric pressure, everything relevant." "Your computers account for static atmospheric conditions," Sarah replied. "They calculate where your bullet should go based on where wind is now. But your bullet spends 7.3 seconds in flight. Wind doesn't stay where it is for 7.3 seconds. It moves. It changes. Your computers can't predict that because they're not modeling the atmosphere as a dynamic fluid system." Morrison stepped closer, his analytical mind engaged. "You're talking about predictive atmospheric modeling, real-time fluid dynamics calculations. That requires computational power we don't have in the field." Sarah looked at Morrison with something that might have been respect. "It requires computational power you don't have. I've been building predictive models in my head for the past 3 hours. I can make that shot." Kane laughed. Actually laughed. "Ma'am, no offense, but we got 8 of the finest snipers in naval special warfare trying to make that shot. What makes you think you can do better?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "I hold 3 national long-range championship titles. My doctoral thesis at Caltech was on predictive atmospheric modeling for ballistic applications. I've been studying this specific valley for 3 weeks while you've been focused on other operational priorities. And I've been watching you fail for 3 hours, which means I now have 37 data points confirming my atmospheric models." She bent down and opened the rifle case. Inside was a Macmillan TAC-50, heavily modified with custom components that spoke of serious money and serious dedication. The rifle looked well used but impeccably maintained. Briggs had been watching this exchange without comment. Now he moved closer, his experienced eye assessing the weapon. "That's custom work. Good custom work. Where'd you get that rifle?" "Built it myself," Sarah said, lifting the rifle from its case with practiced movements. "Over 5 years. Barrel from Bartlett. Trigger work by a gunsmith who used to work for Accuracy International. Stock modified for my specific biomechanics. This rifle has made shots exceeding 2,800 meters under controlled conditions. Controlled conditions aren't combat, Kane said. Sarah finally looked directly at Kane. You're right. Controlled conditions are harder. In controlled conditions, there's no excuse for missing. In combat, everyone expects chaos. Combat is actually more forgiving than competition if you know what you're doing. Harris had moved closer during this exchange. Hendricks, I wasn't aware you had long-range shooting experience. You weren't supposed to be aware, Sarah said simply. My primary function here is intelligence liaison. But before I say, I was considered for Army Marksmanship Unit. Before that, competitive shooting at international level. And before that, my father taught me to shoot when I was 8 years old. Something in the way she said my father carried weight, but she didn't elaborate. Cross was studying her the way he studied all problems that appeared suddenly and demanded attention. You seriously think you can make a shot that 8 experienced combat snipers can't make? I don't think, Sarah said. I know. Your shooters are excellent, but they're trying to solve this problem with mathematics and technology. This valley requires understanding atmospheric physics at a level that can't be taught from textbooks. Briggs spoke for the first time since Sarah had arrived. His voice carried a tone that made everyone pause. Ma'am, I've been shooting long range for 50 years. I've made kills in every environment from Arctic to desert. What makes you think you understand this valley better than we do? Sarah turned to face the old Marine. For a moment, they looked at each other across a generational divide, an experience gap, and a fundamental difference in methodology. Because I've been watching it while you've been shooting at it, Sarah said. Not unkindly, but firmly. Gunnery Sergeant, you read terrain with your eyes and your instinct. That's valuable, but I read it with computational models that simulate air movement in 3 dimensions over time. I see patterns you can't see because they exist in mathematical space, not visual space. Between your fieldcraft and my physics, we could solve this problem. But you've been focused on coaching your team, and I've been in the background doing analysis nobody asked for. Briggs' expression was unreadable. You saying my way doesn't work? I'm saying your way works for one person at a time making intuitive decisions, Sarah said. My way works for building predictive models that can be replicated and taught. Neither way is complete alone, but I don't have time to explain integration theory right now. That target relocates in 5 hours. Harris made a decision that would either validate or destroy his career, depending on what happened in the next few hours. Dr. Hendricks, you've got the range. Everyone else, maintain positions but cease fire. Kane's face showed exactly what he thought of that decision. Webb looked thoughtful. Morrison looked curious. The other SEALs exchanged glances that ranged from skeptical to openly doubtful. But Cross understood what Harris was doing. Sometimes you had to try the unconventional option because the conventional options had all failed. That was how you won wars. That was how you survived impossible situations. Gunny, Harris said, I want you on spotting scope. If Dr. Hendricks is going to take this shot, I want our most experienced eyes confirming or denying her calculations. Briggs's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. Spotting for someone meant supporting their shot, validating their approach. It meant acknowledging they might know something you didn't. But Briggs had been a Marine for longer than some of these men had been alive. Marines followed orders even when they disagreed with them. Aye, sir, Briggs said. He moved to the spotting position, setting up a scope on a tripod with movements that spoke of 10,000 repetitions. Sarah moved to the shooting position, settling into prone with body mechanics that made it clear this wasn't her first time behind a precision rifle. The TAC-50 came up to her shoulder like it had been designed specifically for her, which essentially it had been. I need complete silence, Sarah said quietly. No movement near my position, and I need 30 minutes to study conditions before I take the shot. 30 minutes. With a timeline measured in hours and a target that might disappear at any moment, 30 minutes felt like forever. But Harris nodded. You've got 30 minutes. Use them well. What happened over the next 30 minutes looked like nothing to most observers. Sarah lay behind her rifle, eye to scope, barely moving. Occasionally she'd lift her head and observe the valley through a compact spotting scope. Sometimes she'd write numbers in a small notebook. Mostly she just watched. But what she was doing was anything but simple. Sarah was reading the valley the way a master musician reads a complex score, seeing patterns that weren't visible to conventional observation. She watched how trees bent at different elevations, how the pattern changed meter by meter. She studied dust devils forming and dissipating, tracking how they moved and what that revealed about ground-level wind currents. She observed heat shimmer patterns, seeing temperature layers that affected bullet trajectory in ways most shooters never considered. Every few minutes, she'd pull out a handheld anemometer, taking wind readings at slightly different positions around the shooting area. She was mapping three-dimensional airflow, understanding how it moved not just horizontally but vertically, how temperature differences created pressure gradients that pushed air in counterintuitive directions. Through her scope, she watched the target compound with patient intensity. The warlord appeared periodically, moving between buildings, talking to security personnel. She noted his patterns, calculated his likely positions over the next several hours, identified the moment when his position and atmospheric conditions would align for an optimal shot. She wasn't just measuring conditions. She was understanding them, feeling them, building a complete four-dimensional model of the atmosphere her bullet would travel through. Briggs watched through his spotting scope, trying to see what she saw. After 10 minutes, he gave up, unable to discern whatever pattern Sarah was tracking. But he kept watching, kept observing, and slowly, grudgingly started to notice things. The way she'd take a reading, move 3 feet left, take another reading. She was sampling air at multiple points, building a spatial map. Smart. The way she'd observe distant terrain features, then scribble calculations that looked more like fluid dynamics equations than standard ballistic tables. She wasn't guessing. She was computing. Webb had moved to a position where he could observe without interfering. He pulled out his own spotting scope and tried to follow Sarah's line of sight, figure out what she was studying. The exercise was humbling. She was seeing things he couldn't see, understanding relationships between atmospheric factors that he'd never been taught to consider. Morrison was studying her technique with professional fascination. The way she'd climb to higher ground, take readings, return to shooting position, integrate new data. She was treating the valley like a complex system that needed to be understood holistically, not just measured at a single point. She's mapping atmospheric layers, Morrison whispered to Webb. Not just measuring wind speed, but tracking how different pressure systems interact at different elevations. That's graduate-level meteorology applied to ballistics. Kane stood back with his arms crossed, watching with an expression that said he was waiting for failure, waiting to be proven right that this was a waste of time. At 20 minutes, Sarah pulled out a weather meter and took readings at multiple elevations around their position, climbing to higher ground and lower ground to measure atmospheric gradients with her own body as a mobile sensing platform. She was breathing steadily, completely focused, existing in a state of concentration that shut out everything except the problem she was solving. She returned to her primary shooting position and began making adjustments to her scope. The number she was dialing in looked wrong to anyone watching. Too much elevation compensation. Wind adjustment that seemed opposite to what the Kestrel stations indicated. But Sarah wasn't shooting for where conditions were now. She was shooting for where they would be in 7.3 seconds, during every microsecond of her bullet's flight through air that was moving and changing like a living organism. At 28 minutes, she settled into her final shooting position. Her breathing slowed visibly. Her body relaxed into perfect stillness, the kind of relaxation that required years of training to achieve under stress. Her right hand found the rifle's grip with practiced familiarity, finger resting on the trigger with exactly calibrated pressure. Target is in optimal position, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. Probability window opens in 60 seconds. I'm taking the shot. Harris moved to a position where he could observe through a spotting scope. The high-value target was visible in the compound courtyard, talking to subordinates, completely unaware that a bullet was about to travel nearly 1.5 miles to reach him. Briggs positioned himself behind his spotting scope, ready to call the shot. He was certain it would miss. Everyone missed in these conditions. 37 attempts had proven that, but he was professional enough to hope he was wrong. Sarah's breathing became imperceptible. Her body achieved that perfect stillness that separated master shooters from merely good ones. The rifle became part of her, connected through contact points that had been refined through thousands of hours of practice. She was aware of her heartbeat, timing her shot for the pause between beats when her body was most stable. She was waiting for something only she could sense, a moment when atmospheric conditions throughout the valley aligned into a configuration that would allow her bullet to travel that impossible distance and arrive exactly where she'd calculated. The wind at their position was blowing left to right at 4 miles per hour. But Sarah knew that at 800 meters down range, it would be blowing right to left at 7 miles per hour. At 1,600 meters, it would shift again, pushed by thermal currents rising from the valley floor. And in the final 400 meters before target, yet another pattern would dominate, influenced by the compound's buildings and terrain features surrounding it. She'd mapped all of it, calculated all of it, and now she was waiting for the precise moment when her bullet could thread through that atmospheric maze and find its target. 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. Then, in a moment that would be debated and analyzed for years afterward, she fired. The TAC-50 roared like controlled thunder. The recoil was massive. 50 caliber rounds didn't play games. But Sarah's body positioning was so perfect that the rifle tracked straight back without disturbing her alignment. The suppressor reduced the acoustic signature but couldn't eliminate the fundamental violence of propelling a 750-grain bullet at 2,800 feet per second. The bullet left the muzzle and began its journey through an atmosphere that wanted to push it off course in a dozen different directions. At 0.2 seconds, the bullet was traveling through their immediate position, 4 miles per hour left to right wind, being pushed fractionally off its bore axis. Sarah had accounted for this. At 1.1 seconds, it crossed into a thermal layer where rising air from the valley floor created upward pressure. The bullet lifted slightly higher than standard ballistic calculations would predict. Sarah had accounted for this. At 2.4 seconds, it encountered the 7 miles per hour right to left wind that Sarah had identified. The bullet was pushed back towards centerline in a correction that looked like luck, but was actually precise calculation. At 3.8 seconds, the bullet reached its apex, nearly 280 feet above target elevation before beginning its descent. The air was cooler here, denser, affecting velocity in ways that required quantum-level physics to fully understand. Sarah had accounted for this. At 5.2 seconds, crosswinds from the valley's eastern ridge pushed the bullet left. Sarah had anticipated this, building the correction into her aim point 2 minutes before taking the shot. At 6.5 seconds, the bullet was descending through the final atmospheric layer, affected by ground-level winds that swirled around the compound's buildings. Sarah had mapped these patterns by watching dust and vegetation movement. At 7.28 seconds, the bullet arrived. The SEALs watched through scopes, tracking the target, waiting to see where the round would impact. Most were expecting another miss. High, low, left, right. Somewhere in the general vicinity, but not on target. 7.3 seconds was an eternity in ballistics. Too many variables, too much chaos, too much distance for any human to accurately calculate. But Sarah wasn't any human. The high-value target collapsed like someone had cut his strings. One moment he was standing in the compound courtyard, gesturing toward the mountains. The next moment there was a spray of red mist where his head had been, and his body was falling, dead before it hit the ground. 7.28 seconds of flight time, 2,387 meters of distance through atmospheric conditions that had defeated 37 previous attempts by the best shooters naval special warfare could provide. One shot, one kill, first round impact. The compound erupted into chaos, men scattered like insects, searching for cover, shouting orders, trying to identify where death had come from. Security personnel rushed to their fallen leader, but anyone with medical training could see it was pointless. The shot had been instantly fatal, precise beyond what should have been possible at that range. Briggs lowered his spotting scope slowly. His face showed an expression somewhere between shock and something deeper. Something like recognition. "Holy Mother of God," he breathed. "She actually did it. First round." Webb was shaking his head, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. "That's not possible. The wind data alone should have made that shot impossible." "She didn't use our wind data," Morrison said, his voice carrying a respect that bordered on reverence. "She built her own atmospheric model, mapped the entire valley's air movement patterns, calculated where winds would be during each second of bullet flight, not just where they are now." Harris was on the radio confirming the kill with overhead surveillance assets that had been monitoring the compound. The target was definitely down, definitely dead. The mission that had been consuming resources for weeks was suddenly complete. Sarah was already breaking down her rifle with the same methodical precision she'd used to assemble it. She showed no excitement, no triumph, just the professional satisfaction of someone who'd solved a difficult problem correctly. Her hands moved through the disassembly sequence automatically. muscle memory handling the mechanical task while her mind was already moving on to the next requirement. Cross approached her. Dr. Hendricks, that was the most impressive piece of marksmanship I've seen in 20 years of service. Thank you, Commander, Sarah replied, securing her rifle in its case. The conditions were actually more stable than they initially appeared. Once I mapped the pressure gradients and thermal layers, the solution became relatively straightforward. Relatively straightforward, Kane repeated, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or insulted. Ma'am, I've been shooting long range my entire adult life. What you just did isn't relatively straightforward. That's borderline miraculous. Sarah looked up from her rifle case, meeting Kane's eyes with an expression that was patient but firm. Petty officer, miracles are what people call expertise they don't understand. What I did was apply atmospheric physics and ballistic calculations at a level beyond what standard military training provides. It looks like magic because you haven't been trained to see the patterns I'm seeing. She stood, slinging her rifle case over her shoulder. Your 37 attempts weren't failures. They were data points that confirmed the valley's atmospheric behavior matched my theoretical models. Every one of your shots taught me something about how air was moving through this terrain. You did the groundwork. I just came in with a different analytical framework. It was a diplomatic way of saying she'd watched them fail for 3 hours and used their failures as scientific data to refine her own calculations. Some of the SEALs bristled at the implication, but most recognized it for what it was. Truth delivered without malice. Morrison stepped forward to, "Ma'am, walk me through it, the whole calculation process. I want to understand how you modeled atmospheric conditions at that level of detail." Sarah hesitated, then seemed to decide that sharing knowledge was worth the time investment. She pulled out her notebook and began explaining her methodology, using diagrams and equations that made Morrison's eyes widen with each page. "You're using Navier-Stokes equations," Morrison said, tracing one of the calculations, "for fluid dynamics, applied to air movement through complex terrain. That's computational fluid dynamics at a level that usually requires supercomputers. Or 8 years of practice building the intuition to approximate computational solutions in real time," Sarah replied. "I can't run the full calculations in my head, but I can recognize patterns that indicate specific atmospheric behaviors. Then I apply simplified models that get me close enough for a practical shooting solution." She flipped through several more pages showing how she'd broken the valley into atmospheric zones, calculated pressure differentials between zones, predicted how those differentials would evolve over time, and finally integrated all of that into a ballistic solution that accounted for bullet position at each fraction of a second during its flight. "This is PhD-level physics," Morrison said quietly. "Where did you learn this?" "Caltech," Sarah said. "Doctorate in atmospheric physics with focus on predictive modeling of chaotic air systems. Got recruited by Army Marksmanship Unit because someone in procurement thought my research might have military applications. Turns out they were right. Harris was putting pieces together. ISA recruited specialists with unique capabilities that conventional military units lacked. Sarah's official role was intelligence liaison, but her actual value was as someone who could solve problems that existed at the intersection of multiple highly technical disciplines." Briggs had been standing back, watching this exchange in silence. Now he moved closer. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone pay attention. "Doc," Briggs said, using the informal address for the first time, "that was a hell of a shot. Best I've seen in 50 years. But I got a question." Sarah turned to face him. "Gunnery, Sergeant?" "You saw something," Briggs said, "right before you fired. Something changed in your body language. What was it?" Sarah looked at the old Marine with new respect. He'd been watching her closely enough to catch a subtle shift. That took experience and attention that most people didn't have. "The trees at 1,400 meters," Sarah said. "They'd been bending one direction consistently. Then they shifted, just slightly. It meant the wind pattern I'd been tracking was about to change. I had maybe 8 seconds before the window closed. So I took the shot." "But your calculations said wait," Briggs observed. "I heard you counting down. You shot early." Sarah smiled slightly. It was the first real emotion she'd shown since arriving. "My calculations said the optimal window was 8 seconds away. But your fieldcraft was right, Gunnery Sergeant. Wind is a living thing. It doesn't care about my calculations. When it gives you an opportunity, you take it." Briggs studied her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He extended his hand. "Call me Gunny," he said. And that wasn't just physics that made that shot. That was reading the wind. You might do it with math, but you're reading it same as I do, just using different language. Sarah shook his hand. Then maybe, she said quietly, the best approach uses both languages. Something passed between them in that moment. A recognition that they were looking at the same truth from different angles. That neither approach was complete alone. That maybe, just maybe, there was value in combining old wisdom with new science. The team began packing equipment, preparing for exfiltration. The mission was complete. The target was eliminated. In a few hours, they'd be back at their forward operating base, writing reports and moving on to the next operation. But something had changed on that mountainside. Something that would have consequences none of them could predict. Cross fell into step beside Sarah as they moved toward the extraction point. "Doc, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Commander." "That shot, was it really straightforward once you'd mapped the atmosphere? Or were you just being modest?" Sarah considered the question as they navigated rocky terrain. "Honestly, it was about 70% calculation and 30% educated guess. At that range, in those conditions, you can never account for every variable. But if you understand the major patterns well enough, you can make guesses that are more likely to be right than wrong. Today, my guess was correct." 70-30, Cross repeated. "Most shooters would never take a shot with 30% uncertainty factor." "Most shooters have alternatives," Sarah said. "You had 37 attempts to refine your approach. I had one shot, one opportunity. In that situation, 70-30 odds are better than the mission failing. So you take the shot and trust your training." It was a philosophy that resonated with SEALs who routinely operated in situations where perfect information was impossible and decisions had to be made with incomplete data. But there was something else in Sarah's voice, something that suggested this wasn't just about completing a mission, something personal driving her to prove she could make shots that others couldn't. Cross didn't push. Everyone in special operations had their reasons, their demons, their unfinished business. As long as they did their job professionally, the reasons were their own business. The extraction went smoothly. They reached their rally point, linked up with vehicles that had been pre-positioned, and were back at their forward operating base before enemy forces in the valley could organize any kind of pursuit. In the operations center, Harris pulled Sarah aside while the rest of the team began mission debrief. "Dr. Hendricks, we need to talk about what happens next." Sarah looked at him with that same neutral expression she'd worn most of the day. "Sir?" "What you did today," Harris said carefully, "solves a problem naval special warfare has been struggling with for years. We're engaging targets at longer and longer ranges. Our enemies are learning to stay outside what they think is our effective range. But you just demonstrated capability at distances that shouldn't be possible. Command is going to want to know how to replicate that." "It can't be replicated easily," Sarah said. "What I do requires years of study in atmospheric physics and thousands of hours of practice integrating that knowledge with practical shooting." "I know," Harris said. "But even if we can't create more people like you, we can learn from you, improve our training, develop better tools. You've opened a door, Doctor. The question is whether you're willing to help us walk through it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised Harris. "My father was Colonel James Hendricks, Army Rangers. He died in Iraq in 2007. Harris waited, sensing there was more. "He taught me to shoot when I was 8 years old," Sarah continued. "Wanted me to follow him into service. When I chose academic research instead, he was disappointed. Thought I was too soft for the military, too afraid of the hard choices. We never resolved that before he died." "I'm sorry," Harris said quietly. "I made that shot today," Sarah said, looking directly at Harris. "Not just because it was the mission. I made it because, somewhere, I'm still trying to prove to a dead man that I wasn't too soft, that I could handle the pressure, that I belonged in his world." She paused, then added, "So yes, Commander, I'm willing to help, because maybe if I can teach others to make impossible shots, I can finally prove to myself that my father was wrong about me." Harris understood then that he wasn't just looking at a brilliant scientist. He was looking at someone carrying unfinished business, using her extraordinary capabilities to resolve something that couldn't be resolved any other way. "For what it's worth," Harris said, "I think your father would be proud of what you did today." Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something that suggested Harris's words had landed somewhere important. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. 3 days later, the classified report was brief. Target eliminated at extended range by task force sniper element. Technical details classified. method of engagement classified, contributing personnel classified. But within naval special warfare, the story was already spreading. About the ISA liaison who'd made a shot that 8 SEALs couldn't make. About physics and intuition combining to achieve what technology alone couldn't accomplish. About the quiet professional who'd been hiding world-class capabilities behind a job description that didn't begin to capture her actual value. And in a small office at Naval Special Warfare Command, senior officers were having a conversation about a new training program. One that would marry cutting-edge atmospheric science with old-school fieldcraft. One that would require an unusual partnership between a 68-year-old Marine legend and a 33-year-old scientist with something to prove. A partnership that would change how America's Special Operations Forces thought about long-range precision shooting. A partnership that would be tested in ways none of them could predict. But that was still to come. For now, on a mountainside in the Balkans, the wind continued to blow through a valley that had claimed 37 bullets before finally surrendering to someone who understood that physics and intuition weren't opposing forces. They were the same truth, spoken in different languages. And the key to impossible shots was learning to speak both. The request came through encrypted channels 3 days after the Balkans mission. Naval Special Warfare Command didn't waste time when they saw capability that could change the game. The message was direct, bureaucratically sterile, and carried the weight of institutional momentum. Sarah Hendricks and Gunnery Sergeant William Briggs were requested to co-develop an advanced marksmanship training program. Duration, 6 months. Location, Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center, Bridgeport, California. Purpose, integrate cutting-edge atmospheric science with traditional fieldcraft to push the boundaries of extreme-range precision shooting. Requested was a polite fiction. This was an order dressed in collaborative language. Sarah read the message in her temporary quarters at the forward operating base, sitting on a cot that had supported 1,000 transient warriors before her. The small room smelled of canvas and the particular staleness that came from air that had been breathed too many times. Outside, she could hear the sounds of men maintaining equipment, the rhythmic cadence of military routine that never stopped regardless of mission, success, or failure. 6 months, teaching warriors to see the world the way she saw it, translating mathematics into fieldcraft, theory into practice, calculations into instinct. The thought terrified her more than the shot had. She found Briggs in the armory, methodically cleaning a rifle that probably didn't need cleaning. Old habits, the kind of routine that kept warriors grounded when everything else was chaos. He looked up when she entered, his weathered face showing the fatigue that came from 3 days of mission debrief and the particular exhaustion that followed high-stresses operations. "They sent you the proposal," Briggs said. "Not a question." "How did you know?" Sarah asked. "Because they sent me the same one." Briggs returned his attention to the rifle, running a patch through the barrel with practiced precision. "Command wants us to teach together. Your science, my fieldcraft. Make more shooters who can do what you did." Sarah sat down on a bench across from him. "I'm not sure I can teach what I do. It took me 8 years to develop the intuition for real-time atmospheric modeling. That's not something you can compress into a training course." "They're not asking for a training course," Briggs said, looking up again. "They're asking for 6 months. That's enough time to plant seeds. Some will grow, most won't. That's how it always works with advanced skills. You're considering it." Briggs set down the rifle and patch. "Doc, I'm 68 years old. My knees sound like gravel in a coffee can when I stand up. My back hasn't forgiven me for Vietnam. I should be retired, fishing, doing whatever it is old men do when they're not at war anymore." He paused. "But I've got knowledge in my head that dies when I die unless I pass it on. 50 years of reading terrain, wind, atmospheric conditions. That's worth preserving if I can find students capable of learning it." "So you're saying yes?" "I'm saying I'll do it if you do it," Briggs replied. "Because your way and my way together made that shot in the Balkans. Separate, we're both incomplete. Together we might teach something worth knowing." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the unexpected respect in his words. 3 days ago, he'd been skeptical of her methods. Now he was proposing partnership. "What changed?" she asked. Briggs picked up the rifle again, not because it needed more attention, but because his hands needed something to do. "You proved something I needed to see. That new methods and old methods aren't enemies. They're different tools for the same job. I've spent 50 years being suspicious of people who think technology replaces experience. But you don't think that. You think technology enhances experience. That's different. He looked at her directly. And you listened when I called that wind shift. Your calculations said, wait. I said, shoot. You trusted my read. That tells me you respect fieldcraft even when it contradicts your models. That's rare. Sarah felt something shift. Recognition between professionals who approached problems differently but valued the same things. Precision, dedication, results. I'll do it, she said, on one condition. What's that? We do it as equals. Not you teaching my students, not me teaching yours. We teach together, integrating both approaches from the beginning. If this works, it's because we build something neither of us could build alone. Briggs considered this, then nodded slowly. Agreed, but I got one condition too. Which is? When I'm wrong, you call me on it. When you're wrong, I call you on it. No ego, no politics, just two professionals trying to build the best training program we can. He extended his hand. Deal? Sarah shook it. The old Marine's grip was still strong, despite the age showing in the rest of his body. Deal. Lieutenant Commander Harris entered the armory, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had too many responsibilities and not enough hours. I see you both got the message. We're in, Briggs said before Sarah could speak. But we got requirements. Harris raised an eyebrow. Requirements? Complete authority over curriculum, Sarah said. We select students based on our criteria, not political considerations. We set standards, we determine who passes and who doesn't. And we need operational flexibility, Briggs added. This isn't going to be classroom lectures and range time. We need to take students into challenging environments. Mountains, desert, anywhere atmospheric conditions push the boundaries of conventional shooting. Harris listened, then smiled slightly. Command anticipated most of that. You'll have authority over the program, budget for equipment and travel, and access to any range facilities you need. He paused. But understand, this program will be watched closely. You're proposing to change how naval special warfare thinks about long-range shooting. That means scrutiny. That means proving results. We'll prove results, Sarah said with quiet confidence. When do we start? Briggs asked. 2 weeks. That gives you time to develop initial curriculum and screen candidates. Harris pulled out a tablet, scrolling through data. We've already received 47 applications from SEALs, Marine Scout snipers, and Army Special Forces personnel. You'll need to narrow that to 12 students for the first iteration. 47 applications. Warriors who'd heard about the Balkans shot through the informal network that connected special operations communities. Warriors who wanted to learn whatever had made that impossible shot possible. Sarah felt the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders. These weren't students looking for academic knowledge. These were men whose lives depended on the skills they learned. If she taught them wrong, people died. Briggs seemed to read her thoughts. Doc, every instructor in the military carries that weight. You teach combat skills, you're teaching life and death, but you don't let the weight paralyze you. You just do your best and trust that your best is good enough. 2 weeks later, they stood in a briefing room at the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California. The facility sat at 7,400 feet elevation in the Sierra Nevada mountains, surrounded by terrain that was unforgiving, beautiful, and perfect for pushing shooters beyond their comfort zones. 12 students sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle, 12 of the finest precision shooters that special operations could provide. Cross had made the cut, as had Webb and Morrison. Kane was there too, looking like someone who still had something to prove. The others were equally impressive on paper. Combat veterans, competition shooters, men who'd already demonstrated capability at ranges most soldiers never attempted. Sarah studied them, seeing not just their present capabilities but their potential. Morrison had the analytical mind for atmospheric modeling. Webb had the spatial reasoning. Cross had the leadership to influence others. Kane had the natural shooting talent, but needed humility to channel it effectively. And 8 others, each bringing different strengths, different weaknesses, different reasons for being here. Briggs spoke first. His voice carried the authority of 50 years earning the right to be heard. Gentlemen, welcome to the Briggs Hendricks Advanced Marksmanship course. You're here because you want to make shots that most people think are impossible. You're here because you've already demonstrated capability beyond standard military marksmanship training. And you're here because someone in your chain of command thinks you might be teachable. He let that sink in. Might be teachable? Not guaranteed. This program has a historically high washout rate because we're about to attempt something that hasn't been done before. We're going to teach you to integrate two completely different approaches to long-range shooting. Dr. Hendricks will teach you atmospheric physics, fluid dynamics, and computational methods for predicting bullet trajectory through chaotic air. I'm going to teach you traditional fieldcraft, observational techniques, and how to read terrain like a language. Sarah took over. Some of you are probably wondering why you need both approaches. You've been successful using technology and standard ballistic calculations. But consider this. At 2,000 meters, your bullet spends approximately 6 seconds in flight. During those 6 seconds, atmospheric conditions change. Wind shifts, temperature gradients move, pressure systems evolve. Your ballistic computer calculates based on conditions at the moment you pull the trigger. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs reads how those conditions are about to change. My methods predict where conditions will be during each microsecond of bullet flight. Separately, each approach has limitations. Together, they create capability that neither achieves alone. Morrison raised his hand. Ma'am, how much mathematics are we talking about? I've got college-level calculus, but if we're getting into computational fluid dynamics, most of us will be lost. You don't need to derive the equations, Sarah said. You need to understand the principles well enough to recognize patterns. I'll teach you what to look for. Then we'll practice until pattern recognition becomes intuitive. That's how expertise develops. Enough repetitions that conscious thought becomes unconscious competence. Kane spoke up, his tone carrying less arrogance than it had in the Balkans, but still edged with challenge. Gunny, you've made hundreds of kills using traditional methods. Why change now? Briggs looked at Kane with an expression that was patient but firm. Son, I'm not changing, I'm adapting. There's a difference. I still trust my eyes and my instinct more than any computer. But I also recognize that Dr. Hendricks can calculate things I can only feel. When we combine calculation and intuition, we get results that neither achieves alone. You saw that in the Balkans. Your choice is whether you're humble enough to learn something new or arrogant enough to think you already know everything. Kane's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Understood, Gunny. The first week was classroom instruction. Sarah teaching atmospheric physics, demonstrating how air moved in 3 dimensions, how temperature created density gradients, how pressure systems interacted. She used visual aids, computer simulations, and real-world examples to make abstract concepts concrete. The students responded differently. Morrison absorbed the material like a sponge, asking questions that showed he was integrating new knowledge with existing expertise. Webb was more methodical, taking detailed notes, requesting clarification when concepts weren't clear. Cross focused on how to apply the knowledge operationally rather than understanding every theoretical detail. Kane struggled, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he kept trying to reduce everything to simple rules. He wanted formulas that always worked rather than principles that required judgment. During a break on the 3rd day, Sarah found Kane staring at equations on a whiteboard with visible frustration. It's not clicking, Kane admitted when he noticed her. I understand the individual concepts, but I don't see how they integrate into a shooting solution. Sarah picked up a marker and drew a simple diagram. Stop thinking of this as math you need to solve. Think of it as a language you need to read. When you look at atmospheric conditions, you're reading a story about how air is moving right now and how it's about to move. My equations just formalize that story. Gunny reads the same story by observing nature. Different language, same story. So how do I learn to read it? Kane asked. The same way you learn to read English, immersion, repetition, making mistakes until patterns become familiar. Sarah looked at him directly. You're trying to master this in 3 days. It took me 8 years. Give yourself time to learn. Something in Kane's expression shifted. 8 years? To get truly proficient. But you'll start seeing patterns within weeks if you stay open to learning. The question is whether you can accept being a beginner again after years of being an expert. Kane was quiet for a moment. That's the hard part, admitting I don't know something. That's the first step toward knowing it, Sarah said simply. The 2nd week they moved to the range. Briggs took over instruction, teaching observational skills that seemed almost mystical until students started to understand the logic behind them. See those aspens at 800 meters? Briggs said, pointing at a grove of trees. Watch how the leaves move. Not just that they're moving, but the pattern. See how the tops are fluttering fast, but the lower branches are barely moving? That tells you wind speed is higher at altitude than at ground level. Wind gradient, your bullet passes through both zones, so you need to account for both. He walked the students through terrain reading, showing them how to identify thermal layers by watching heat shimmer, how to predict wind shifts by observing cloud formations, how to estimate pressure changes by reading animal behavior. Webb was the natural at this. Something about the way his mind processed spatial information made him particularly adept at seeing patterns in nature. Within 3 days, he was making observations that impressed even Briggs. Chief Webb, Briggs said after Webb correctly predicted a wind shift 30 seconds before it happened, "You've got the eye. The question is whether you can marry what you're seeing with what Dr. Hendricks is calculating." "Working on it, Gunny," Webb replied with a slight smile. By week 3, they began integrated exercises. Students would analyze atmospheric conditions using both Sarah's computational methods and Briggs's observational techniques, then attempt shots at progressively longer ranges. The results were mixed. Some students struggled to integrate the two approaches, defaulting to one method or the other. Others, like Morrison and Webb, started to find the synthesis, making shots that surprised even themselves. Cross was more interested in the command implications than personal skill development. "Ma'am Gunny, how do we scale this? If it takes weeks for talented shooters to start integrating both methods, how do we deploy this capability operationally?" "You don't scale it to everyone," Sarah said. "You identify personnel with aptitude for both analytical thinking and intuitive observation. You train them intensively, then you deploy them as specialized assets for missions requiring extreme range precision." "Tier 1 capability," Briggs added. "Not something every sniper needs, but something we need to have available when conventional solutions won't work." It was during week 4 that the situation with Kane came to a head. The students were at an outdoor range, attempting 1,800-meter shots in challenging wind conditions. Kane had been struggling all morning, missing consistently while Morrison and Webb were making hits. After his 6th miss, Kane stood up from his rifle, visibly frustrated. "This is bullshit. I've got all the data. Wind speed, direction, temperature, everything. The ballistic computer should be giving me the solution, but I keep missing." Briggs walked over, his movement slow, his expression neutral. "What does your computer say the wind is doing?" 4 miles per hour, full value left to right," Kane said, checking his handheld device. "And what are the trees at 1,200 meters doing?" Kane looked down range. "Bending left to right," confirms the wind call. "Now look at the grass at 600 meters. Kane looked. After a moment, his expression changed. The grass was bending right to left, opposite direction. "Wind's doing something different at different ranges," Briggs said quietly. "Your computer measures wind here, but your bullet travels through there and there and there." He pointed at different distances. "You're getting one piece of information and trying to apply it to a journey that passes through a dozen different wind conditions. That's why you're missing." "So what's the solution?" Kane asked, frustration evident in his voice. "The solution is stop relying on one tool," Briggs said. "Your computer gives you baseline data. Your eyes give you real-time observation. Dr. Hendricks' modeling gives you prediction. You need all three." "That's too much to process," Kane said. "No," Sarah interjected, walking over to join them. "It's too much to process consciously. That's why you train until it becomes unconscious. Until you look at terrain and automatically integrate data, observation, and prediction without thinking about it. That's what expertise is. And you're not there yet because you're trying to skip the learning phase." Kane looked at both instructors, something warring in his expression, pride fighting with the realization that his approach wasn't working. "How long?" he asked finally. "How long until I can do what you're describing?" "Depends on how hard you work," Briggs said, "and how willing you are to fail while learning. Some students get it in weeks. Others take months. A few never get it because they can't let go of needing to be right all the time." Kane absorbed that. "I don't want to wash out." "Then stop trying to be perfect," Sarah said. "Start trying to learn." Big difference. It was the next day when Kane made his proposal. The students were gathered for morning instruction when Kane stood up, his body language suggesting someone who'd made a decision and was committed to seeing it through regardless of consequences. "Ma'am Gunny, I want to propose something," Kane said. Briggs and Sarah exchanged glances. "We're listening," Sarah said carefully. "Tomorrow, 2,200-meter range, public demonstration. I'll take a shot using pure technology. Just ballistic computer, kestrel data, laser rangefinder. Gunny takes a shot using pure traditional methods, just observation and instinct. Dr. Hendricks takes a shot using her integrated approach. We see whose method gets closest to center. The room went quiet. What Kane was proposing was essentially a challenge, a public test of which methodology was superior. Cross spoke up. Kane, what's the point of this? We're supposed to be learning to integrate approaches, not competing to prove one is better. The point, Kane said, is that some of us are still skeptical, still wondering if we really need both methods. A demonstration would answer that question definitively. Sarah looked at Briggs. The old Marine's expression was unreadable, but she could see him thinking through implications. You want to make this a competition? Briggs said slowly. I want to settle this question, Kane replied. With respect, Gunny, some of us old-school shooters think your traditional methods are enough. Some of the younger guys think technology is enough. Dr. Hendricks thinks we need both. Let's test it. Briggs looked at Sarah. Doc, your call. You want to do this? Sarah considered. Part of her recognized this as a teaching moment, but another part knew that public competitions had risks. If she lost, students might dismiss her methods. If she won by too much, it might discourage students from trying. But there was a third option. Use the competition to prove that integration beats specialization. Modified proposal, Sarah said. Tomorrow, 2,200 meters. 3 shots. Kane uses pure technology. Gunny uses pure traditional observation. I use integrated approach. But here's the addition. Webb, you use whatever combination of methods you've learned so far. 4 shooters, 4 different approaches. We see which philosophy produces the best result. Webb looked surprised at being included. Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm ready for public demonstration. None of us are ever ready, Sarah said. But this is a teaching moment for everyone, so we do it right. Cross nodded approval. Commander Harris should observe. If we're testing training methodologies, command needs to see the results. Agreed, Briggs said. Tomorrow morning, 0800, all students present. This isn't entertainment, this is education. That evening, Sarah sat alone on a small hill overlooking the training complex, watching the sun set behind mountain peaks that looked like they'd been cut from stone by a careless god. The air at 7,400 feet was thin, cold, sharp in her lungs. She heard footsteps behind her. Briggs settled down on the ground with a grunt that spoke of knees that protested every position change. You didn't have to accept his challenge, Briggs said after a moment of companionable silence. Neither did you, Sarah replied. Fair point. Briggs was quiet for a moment. You worried about tomorrow? Should I be? That's not an answer, Doc. Sarah looked at the old Marine. In the fading light, the lines on his face seemed deeper, the weight of years more visible. I'm worried that if I win too easily, students will think it's about me being special rather than the method being sound. I'm worried that if I struggle, they'll dismiss everything we've taught. So you're worried about optics rather than the shot itself, Briggs observed. Aren't you? Not really. Briggs shifted, finding a more comfortable position on the hard ground. Doc, I learned a long time ago that you can't control what people think. You can only control what you do. Tomorrow, you do your best. So do I. So does Kane. So does Webb. Students will learn whatever they're capable of learning from watching. That's all we can do. When did you get so philosophical? Sarah asked with a slight smile. 68 years of living teaches you what matters and what doesn't. Briggs looked at the sunset. You know what I think matters tomorrow? What? Showing those men that neither my way nor your way is complete. That the future isn't about choosing between old school and new school. It's about building something better than either. That's what matters. Sarah nodded slowly. Gunny, can I ask you something personal? Depends on how personal. Why are you really doing this? You could be retired, comfortable. Instead, you're teaching young men skills you spent 50 years learning. What's driving you? Briggs was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that went beyond the words. I'm 78 years old, Doc, not 68. I lied on my contractor paperwork because I knew they wouldn't hire someone my real age. Sarah turned to stare at him. 78? 78. Vietnam was 53 years ago. I was 24 when I made my first confirmed kill. Do the math. He looked at her directly. I don't have much time left. Body's breaking down. Mind's still sharp, but the body won't keep up much longer. So I'm here because I need to pass on what I know before I can't anymore. That's what drives me. Making sure that 50 years of hard-earned knowledge doesn't die with me. Does Command know? Harris knows. He's kept it quiet because I can still do the job. But yeah, he knows. Briggs smiled slightly. So if you're wondering why I'm invested in making this program work, that's why. This is my last mission, Doc. Teaching the next generation everything I learned so they don't have to learn it the hard way. That's legacy. That's what matters at the end. Sarah felt something shift in how she saw the old Marine. Not just a skilled instructor, a man racing against time to preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. Thank you for listening, Briggs replied. Now let's get some sleep. Tomorrow we teach those young men something important. Morning came cold and clear. Perfect visibility. Wind moderate and predictable. The kind of conditions that made long-range shooting straightforward if you knew what you were doing. All 12 students gathered at the observation area. Commander Harris had arrived from San Diego overnight. The atmosphere carried the weight of something significant about to happen. The target was set at 2,200 meters. Paper target, clear aiming point, electronic scoring system to measure shot placement precisely. Kane shot first. He set up his rifle with meticulous care, checking ballistic computer data, verifying kestrel readings, calculating drop and wind drift using pure technology. His shooting position was technically perfect, his trigger control smooth. The shot rang out. Electronic scoring showed impact 18 inches low, 14 inches left of center. Respectable at that range. Better than most military snipers could achieve, but not center hit. Kane stood up, expression neutral, but clearly disappointed. Briggs shot second. He spent 10 minutes observing the range, watching trees, clouds, heat shimmer. No instruments, no calculations, just pure observation, synthesized through 50 years of experience. When he finally settled behind his rifle, his movements were economical, efficient, old body compensating through perfected technique. He breathed twice, slowly, then fired. Electronic scoring showed impact 8 inches high, 6 inches right, closer than Kane, better wind read, but still not center. Briggs stood, showing no emotion. Wind shifted on me midpoint, should have accounted for that. Webb shot third. He combined methods, using Kestrel for baseline data, but then spending time observing nature like Briggs had taught. He pulled out notes from Sarah's class, reviewing atmospheric modeling principles. His shot took longer to execute, more thinking involved. But when he fired, electronic scoring showed impact 5 inches high, 3 inches left. Best so far. The students murmured. Webb's integrated approach had beaten both specialists. Sarah shot last. She observed, calculated, integrated data and intuition in the way she'd done 1,000 times. But something felt different today. Pressure of performance, maybe. Or the weight of proving that her teaching methods actually worked when someone was watching. She settled into position, controlled her breathing, waited for the moment when everything aligned. She fired. Electronic scoring showed impact 2 inches from absolute center, close enough to be called a hit by any reasonable standard. But before anyone could react to the results, someone shouted a warning. Incoming! The sound came a split second later. Mortar rounds impacting around the range complex. Explosions that turned morning calm into instant chaos. Take cover! Harris was shouting, pulling students toward protective berms. More impacts. Closer now. Someone had known exactly where they were, exactly when they'd be here. Intelligence leak or careful observation, the result was the same. They were under attack. Sarah found herself pressed against a berm with Briggs beside her, both of them scanning for the source of the attack. There! Briggs pointed at a ridgeline 1,600 meters north. Spotter, he's calling the mortars. Sarah pulled out her rifle from its case, hands moving automatically. But as she brought it up, reality hit. She'd fired hundreds of rounds at paper targets. She'd never fired at a human being with the intent to kill. Her hands started shaking. Doc! Cross was shouting from nearby. Someone take that shot. That spotter's killing Marines. But all the student rifles had been packed away for safety after the competition. Only Sarah's rifle was still accessible, already set up, already zeroed. She tried to get into position, tried to make her body do what it had done thousands of times. But her mind was screaming that this was different. This was a person. This was taking a life. She couldn't breathe, couldn't focus, couldn't shoot. Briggs was suddenly beside her, his weathered hand on her shoulder. Sarah, his voice cut through the panic. Look at me. She looked at him. His eyes were calm, steady, the eyes of someone who'd been here before. You've made this shot 1,000 times, Briggs said quietly but firmly. Target's a target. Only difference is this one shoots back. Those Marines over there are dying because you're hesitating. Your father was a ranger. You think he'd want you to freeze when warriors need you? The mention of her father broke through the paralysis. Colonel James Hendricks wouldn't have frozen. He'd have taken the shot because that's what warriors did when their brothers needed them. Sarah's hands steadied. Training took over. Muscle memory bypassing conscious thought. She settled into position. Briggs moved a spotter scope without being asked. Their partnership from the Balkans reasserting itself under pressure. Wind 3 miles per hour, right to left, Briggs called. Heat shimmer moderate. Target's moving. Scanning with binos. Wait for him to stabilize. Sarah's world narrowed to the scope picture. Target acquired. Range confirmed. Atmospheric conditions assessed. All the training, all the preparation, crystallizing into a single moment of absolute clarity. Steady, Briggs said. Wait, now, send it. Sarah fired. 1,600 meters of distance. 4.7 seconds of flight time. The spotter dropped. Mortar fire ceased moments later as the enemy crew lost their forward observer. Sarah stayed in position for a moment, processing what she'd just done. She'd taken a human life, ended someone's existence with physics and mathematics in a precisely placed bullet. She started shaking again. Not from fear this time, from the weight of what she'd done. Briggs stayed beside her, didn't speak, just presence. Silent acknowledgement that this moment changed you, and there was no way around that. The attack ended as quickly as it had started. 3 Marines wounded, none critically. Enemy force withdrawn after losing their spotter and key crew members to return fire. In the aftermath, students helped treat wounded, secured the perimeter, did all the things that warriors did after contact. Professional, efficient. The training taking over when adrenaline faded. Sarah sat against a berm, staring at nothing. Briggs settled down beside her, moving with the care of old joints protesting recent exertion. First one's always hard, Briggs said quietly. I thought I was ready, Sarah replied, her voice distant. All that training, all those competitions. But when it was real, you froze, it happens, even to good people. Briggs paused, especially to good people. Sociopaths don't freeze. People with conscience do. How did you handle it? Your first kill? Threw up after, Briggs said simply. Vietnam, 1971. 1971, not 73 like I told command. I was 24. Thought being sick meant I was weak. My spotter, old corporal named Jimmy Reese, he told me the same thing I'm telling you. Day you don't feel it is the day you should quit. Respect for life is what makes you a sniper, not a murderer. Sarah looked at him. I can't stop thinking about who he was, if he had family, if someone's going to miss him. He was someone who was killing Marines, Briggs said, his voice gentle but firm. Someone who would have kept killing if you hadn't stopped him. You think about his family? Think about the families of the Marines who are alive because you pulled that trigger. Think about Marcus Webb getting to go home to his 3 kids. That's what your shot bought. That's what matters. My father, Sarah said after a moment, Colonel James Hendricks, Army Rangers. He died in Iraq 7 years ago. We had this argument before his last deployment. He said I was too soft for the military, that I'd never be able to make the hard choices. That's why I went into research instead of service. I thought he was right, that I didn't have what it took. And today, Briggs asked? Today I proved him wrong, but it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like losing something. That's because you did lose something, Briggs said. You lost the version of yourself that never took a life. You can't get that back. But you gained something too. You gained the knowledge that when your brothers needed you, you didn't fail them. Your father was wrong about you being soft, but he was also wrong about what makes someone strong. Strength isn't not caring. Strength is caring and doing it anyway. They sat in silence for a while. Around them, the business of aftermath continued. Medical evacuation, damage assessment, reports to higher command, the machinery of military response processing the violence into paperwork and lessons learned. Kane approached them, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Ma'am Gunny, I need to apologize. Sarah looked up at the young SEAL. For what? For everything. For the attitude, for the challenge, for being so convinced I knew better when I clearly didn't. Kane's voice carried genuine contrition. What you did today, making that shot under fire after watching us compete like it was some kind of game, that's what real warriors do. and I've been acting like a tourist who thinks reading a guidebook makes him an expert. Kane, Briggs said, his tone gruff but not unkind. You screwed up. You let arrogance override learning. But you're also standing here admitting it instead of making excuses. That's growth. Take it and move forward. I want to learn, Kane said. Really learn. Both methods. Whatever it takes. No more shortcuts. No more trying to prove I'm already good enough. I want to be actually good enough. Sarah managed a slight smile despite everything. Then show up tomorrow, ready to start over as a beginner. That's all any of us can ask. Kane nodded and walked away. His body language had changed, less swagger, more humility. Sometimes it took crisis to break through ego and reach the person underneath. Webb came over next. Ma'am, that shot saved lives, my life probably, thank you. You would have done the same, Sarah said. Maybe, but you did it today, and that matters. Webb looked at both instructors. You two together, the way you just worked that shot. That's what we're supposed to learn, isn't it? Not just the calculations or the observation, but how to trust each other enough to combine both under pressure. That's exactly what you're supposed to learn, Briggs said. Took Doc and me one crisis to figure out we work better together. Hopefully it takes you students less time. Harris approached, his expression showing the weight of command decisions made in crisis. Dr. Hendricks, Gunnery Sergeant, Briggs, that was exceptional work under fire. I'm recommending both of you for commendation. Not necessary, sir, Sarah said. We did what was needed. Which is exactly why it's necessary, Harris replied. But beyond that, this incident proves the value of your training program. Chief Webb made his shot using integrated techniques. Dr. Hendricks performed under combat stress. The methodology works. Command will want this program expanded. Respectfully, sir, Briggs said. We need to finish training these 12 before we think about expanding. Quality over quantity. Agreed, Harris said. Finish this iteration. Prove the concept completely. Then we'll discuss scaling. Over the following months, the program transformed. The competition that had almost happened became a teaching moment about ego versus effectiveness. The mortar attack became a reference point for why training mattered. Students progressed at different rates. Webb and Morrison excelled, making shots at ranges exceeding 2,100 meters consistently. Kane transformed from arrogant to dedicated, working twice as hard as anyone else to make up for lost time. Cross developed into someone who could teach others, taking advanced concepts and making them accessible. Sarah and Briggs developed a rhythm. She'd teach the theory. He'd teach the application. Together, they'd supervise practical exercises that forced students to integrate both approaches under increasingly challenging conditions. They took students to different environments: desert heat shimmer, coastal marine layers, mountain wind patterns, each location teaching different lessons about how atmosphere affected bullets over distance. By month 4, students were regularly making hits beyond 2,000 meters. By month 5, they were doing it in conditions that would have defeated them before training. The transformation was visible. Warriors who'd started the program thinking they knew everything about long-range shooting now understood how much they hadn't known. The humility made them better. The integrated approach made them capable. On the final day of training, all 12 students graduated. Each had demonstrated proficiency at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters using integrated methodologies. Each had earned the right to be called expert in extreme range precision shooting. Harris presided over the graduation, making it formal despite the small group. What you 12 have accomplished over the past 6 months represents a fundamental advancement in special operations capability. You've proven that marksmanship isn't just about equipment or experience. It's about synthesis, about combining the best of traditional and modern approaches. He looked at Sarah and Briggs, and you two have created something that will outlive all of us. A training program that will produce warriors capable of making shots that conventional doctrine says are impossible. That's legacy. That's impact. After the ceremony, students dispersed to their units, carrying new skills and new perspectives. The quiet ranges of Bridgeport returned to routine training, other courses, other students. Sarah and Briggs stood at the range where the competition had taken place, where the mortar attack had changed everything. 6 months, Sarah said. Feels longer. Good programs always do, Briggs replied. You pack a lot of learning into compressed time. Days blend together. What happens now? Sarah asked. Command wants to expand the program, but we can't train everyone who applies. We don't train everyone, Briggs said. We train instructors, people like Webb and Morrison who can take what we taught and teach others. That's how you scale without losing quality. You build a cadre of people who understand the methodology well enough to pass it on. Sarah nodded slowly. You're talking about legacy, about building something that continues after we're gone. I'm talking about not being the bottleneck, Briggs said. I'm 78, Doc. I can't do this forever. You can do it longer, but eventually you'll move on too. The program needs to exist independent of us. That means building instructors who can carry it forward. Webb could do it, Sarah said. Morrison too. Kane might surprise us once he gets some experience. All of them could do it, Briggs said, because you taught them not just what to do, but why it works. That's what lets people teach others. Understanding the principles, not just the procedures. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed their students' transformation from good shooters into exceptional ones. Gunny, Sarah said finally, thank you for everything, for challenging me, for spotting my first combat shot, for being honest when I was wrong, for building this with me. Briggs looked at her with something that might have been paternal pride. Doc, you proved your father wrong about you. You're not soft. You're not incapable of hard choices. You're exactly what Special Operations needs. Someone who combines intelligence with courage. Someone who can teach warriors to think beyond what they've always done. You really think he'd be proud? Sarah asked quietly. I know he would be, Briggs said with certainty, because I'm proud of you, and I'm a crusty old Marine who doesn't impress easily. If I can see what you've accomplished, your father would have seen it too. Sarah felt something release in her chest, a weight she'd been carrying since her father's death. Maybe she'd never get his approval directly, but the approval of this warrior who'd spent 50 years earning the right to judge, that meant something. So what's next? Sarah asked. Next, Briggs said with a slight smile, we do it again. Different students, same mission. Building warriors who can make impossible shots when the mission demands it. That's what we do. That's who we are now. And in the fading light of a California evening, two instructors who'd approached the same problem from opposite directions stood together, looking toward a future they'd built through partnership, persistence, and the understanding that neither old wisdom nor new science was complete alone. The crucible had tested them. The students had challenged them. The mission had transformed them. But the work continued. Because legacy wasn't built in 6 months, it was built over years, one student at a time, one shot at a time, one life saved at a time. And they were just getting started. 4 years passed like water through fingers. The Briggs Hendricks Advanced Marksmanship course became permanent doctrine at Naval Special Warfare. 3 more iterations trained 36 additional students. Webb became an assistant instructor, his natural talent for observational fieldcraft making him valuable for teaching the next generation. Morrison deployed to multiple theaters, making shots that mission reports described simply as long-range precision engagement, without elaborating on distances that would have been impossible before the training. Kane earned his place among the quiet professionals, his transformation from arrogant youth to dedicated craftsman complete. The competition that had almost destroyed his career became a teaching moment he shared with new students. Humility learned through crisis, growth earned through failure. Sarah continued teaching, refining curriculum, developing new methods for atmospheric modeling that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. She published papers in classified journals, presented to senior command, became the recognized expert in a field that barely existed before she helped create it. And Gunny Briggs kept teaching, despite a body that protested more each year. 78 became 80, 80 became 82. His hands developed tremors that made holding a rifle difficult. His lungs, compromised by decades of cigarettes and exposure to burn pits in Iraq, struggled with the thin air at elevation. Doctors gave him treatments that bought time without promising cure. But his mind remained sharp. His eyes still read terrain like a language. His voice still carried the authority of someone who'd earned every word through 5 decades of service. So he kept teaching because the alternative was accepting that his contribution was finished. And William Briggs wasn't ready to accept that. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November. Sarah was at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, reviewing curriculum updates with Webb, when her secure phone buzzed with the priority signal that meant someone important needed her immediately. The voice on the other end belonged to a JSOC operations officer she'd worked with twice before. The kind of person who only called when conventional solutions had failed and someone needed capability that existed outside normal channels. Dr. Hendricks, we have a situation. Yemen, American hostages, timeline measured in hours. We need you and Gunnery Sergeant Briggs. 20 minutes later, she was in a classified briefing room looking at satellite imagery of a compound in the mountains east of Sana'a. The compound sat on a ridgeline surrounded by terrain that made approach difficult and escape routes numerous. Fortified, defended, held by an ISIS-affiliated group that had proven both competent and ruthless. 4 American hostages had been taken 72 hours earlier during a failed rescue attempt. Intelligence had located them in this compound, but the compound's position made conventional assault problematic. Airstrikes risked killing hostages. Ground assault required crossing open terrain under fire from elevated positions. Every conventional option carried unacceptable risk, except one. The compound's primary guard tower sat exactly 2,647 meters from the only observation point that provided line of sight. A shot at the edge of what was considered possible, even by special operations standards. A shot through desert air so hot that heat shimmer created optical chaos. A shot that would need to be synchronized with a rescue team breach, timed to within seconds, executed perfectly on first attempt because there would be no second chance. The operations officer, a Navy commander named Peterson, zoomed the satellite image to show the observation point. Rocky outcrop, minimal cover, exposed to enemy observation if anyone was paying attention. The kind of position that made tactics officers nervous and snipers resigned. We've had a SEAL team on site for 18 hours, Peterson said. 12 shooters, 43 attempts, 0 hits. The atmospheric conditions are defeating every conventional shooting solution we can develop. Sarah studied the imagery, already building mental models of how air would move through that terrain. Desert environment. Extreme temperature differentials between sun-exposed slopes and shadowed valleys. Thermal currents that would create unpredictable wind patterns. Mirage effects that would make range estimation nearly impossible using conventional methods. Who are the hostages, Sarah asked. Peterson pulled up personnel files, 3 contractors, and one face that made Sarah's breath catch. Chief Marcus Webb, SEAL team leader, former student, the man who'd become an assistant instructor at Bridgeport, the warrior with 3 kids who'd thanked her for saving his life during the mortar attack 4 years ago. Webb had been leading the initial rescue attempt when everything went wrong. Ambush, overwhelming fire, 3 contractors captured. Webb stayed behind to cover their retreat, buying time with his life as currency. Captured alive, beaten, held as a trophy by men who understood his value both tactically and symbolically. How long do we have? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the emotions churning underneath. 18 hours, Peterson said. After that, intelligence indicates they relocate hostages to an unknown location. We lose this opportunity, we may not get another. I need Gunny Briggs, Sarah said immediately. Already contacted. He's flying in from Arizona, should arrive in 6 hours. Peterson looked at her directly. Dr. Hendricks, I need to know. Can you make this shot? Because if you can't, we're looking at a hostage execution scenario that will have significant political implications beyond the human cost. Sarah looked at Webb's photo. The man who'd absorbed her teaching, integrated both approaches, become someone she trusted to carry forward the mission. The man whose family deserved to have him come home. I can make the shot, Sarah said with certainty she didn't entirely feel. But I'll need gunny spotting. We work together or we don't work at all. Understood, you'll fly out in 8 hours. Full support package. Whatever equipment you need. Whatever backup you require. JSOC is giving you complete operational authority for the shooting element. 8 hours later, Sarah was on a C-17 heading east across the Atlantic, surrounded by gear and the quiet professionals who made high-risk operations routine. Cross was there, now a lieutenant commander, leading the SEAL element that would execute the hostage rescue. Kane was there too, older, more weathered, part of the team that would breach the compound when Sarah's shot created the distraction they needed. And in a seat near the back, looking smaller than Sarah remembered, was Gunny Briggs. She made her way back through the cargo hold, navigating equipment and personnel with the ease of someone who'd done this before. Briggs looked up when she approached, his face showing the toll that 4 years and cancer had taken. He'd lost weight. His skin had the papery quality that came from treatments that fought disease by poisoning the body slightly less than they poisoned the cancer. His hands showed tremors even at rest. But his eyes were still sharp, still focused, still carrying the weight of 5 decades of knowledge. Doc, Briggs said by way of greeting. Heard we're going back to work. Sarah sat down beside him. Yemen, 2,600 meters, desert environment, and Marcus Webb is one of the hostages. Briggs absorbed that information without visible reaction. Webb's a good man, deserves to go home to his kids. We're going to make that happen, Sarah said with confidence she was trying to manifest into reality. Briggs looked at her with an expression that suggested he was about to say something difficult. Doc, I need to tell you something. My cancer's progressed, stage 4 now. Treatments aren't working like they used to. My hands shake. Can't hold a rifle steady anymore. I'm not sure I can spot for you the way I used to. Sarah felt cold settle in her stomach. How bad? Bad enough that I probably shouldn't be here, Briggs said honestly. But when they told me Webb was captured and you were going to take the shot, I couldn't stay home. That boy learned from both of us. He's our responsibility, our legacy. So I'm here, even if I'm not at 100%. Gunny, if you can't hold the scope steady, then we figure something else out, Briggs interrupted. Doc, I've been doing this for 55 years, 5.5 decades of reading wind and terrain and atmospheric conditions that can't be measured by instruments. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because my hands shake. We'll find a way to make it work. Sarah looked at the old Marine, seeing not just the disease ravaging his body, but the indomitable will that had kept him going long past the point where most men would have quit. Okay, we'll make it work, together. They landed at a forward operating base in Djibouti as the sun was setting, turning the African sky into shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if anyone had time to appreciate them. Immediate briefing, mission timeline, rules of engagement, the machinery of special operations preparing for an operation that had too many variables and too few good options. The SEAL team that had been attempting the shot for 18 hours looked exhausted, frustrated, defeated by a valley that wouldn't cooperate, and a distance that made every conventional solution fail. Their team leader, a lieutenant named Garrett, briefed Sarah with the careful tone of someone reporting failure to someone who might succeed where he couldn't. Ma'am, we've tried everything. Different rifles, different ammunition, different atmospheric models. The heat shimmer alone makes range estimation problematic. Add in wind that changes direction at different elevations, thermal currents that create unpredictable bullet rise, and mirage effects that make observation difficult. We're shooting at a target we can barely see through air that won't cooperate. Sarah studied their shooting data, seeing patterns that confirmed her atmospheric models. You're not missing because your shooters are inadequate. You're missing because you're trying to solve a 4-dimensional problem with 3-dimensional tools. The air in that valley isn't static. It's evolving constantly. You need to predict where conditions will be during bullet flight, not just where they are when you pull the trigger. Can you do that? Garrett asked. I've done it before, Sarah said, but never at this range, never in conditions this extreme, and never with Webb's life depending on it. She looked at the lieutenant directly. I'm going to need your team's observations, everything you've learned about how wind moves through that valley. I'll integrate your data with my models and Gunny's fieldcraft. Together we might have enough information to make this work. Cross entered the briefing room, his presence immediately commanding attention. 4 years had added weight to his shoulders, both literal and figurative. Command responsibility, men's lives depending on his decisions, the particular aging that came from caring deeply about outcomes. Sarah, Gunny, Cross acknowledged them with the familiarity of shared history. JSOC has approved the operation. We insert at 0300 local time. Your shooting position will be established by 0430. First light is 0545. We synchronize the shot with our breach. You hit the guard tower, we go in 30 seconds later. Timing is critical. Understood, Sarah said. What's the backup plan if I miss? We don't have one, Cross said bluntly. If you miss, guards will be alerted. They'll move hostages or execute them. Either way, we lose, so the plan is you don't miss. No pressure, Sarah said with dark humor. Just another day saving the world, Cross replied, matching her tone. Then his expression softened slightly. Sarah, I've seen what you can do. I've watched you train dozens of shooters who can now make shots they couldn't make before. I trust your capability. The question is whether you trust it. Sarah thought about that. Did she trust her own capability? The calculations she'd refined over years? The intuition she'd developed through thousands of shots? The integration of science and art that she and Briggs had built together? I trust it, she said finally. And I trust Gunny, Together, we've made impossible shots before. We'll make another one tomorrow. The insertion went smoothly. Helicopters under night vision, flying low to avoid radar, depositing teams at pre-planned locations with the precision that came from endless practice and millions of dollars in technology. Sarah and Briggs were dropped at the observation point with 2 SEAL security personnel, enough gear to support a long-duration shoot if necessary, and the weight of a mission that had no room for error. They established position as the sky was just beginning to show the first hint of dawn, that particular shade of dark blue that preceded sunrise. Sarah set up her rifle, the custom TAC-50 that had been her companion for a decade, while Briggs arranged his spotting scope on a tripod that would compensate for his hand tremors. The valley revealed itself slowly as light increased. Harsh beauty, rocky terrain that looked like it had been shaped by violence. The compound sat on its ridgeline like a fortress, stone walls and guard towers positioned to provide maximum defensive advantage, 2,647 meters away. Nearly 1.65 miles of air that was already beginning to shimmer as the sun heated sand and rock. Sarah began her atmospheric analysis, but immediately encountered problems. Her electronic instrumentation was failing in the extreme heat, kestrels giving inconsistent readings, thermal imagers struggling with the temperature differentials. The technology she'd relied on for years wasn't reliable in this environment. "Instruments are failing," Sarah said quietly to Briggs. "I'm getting bad data. Can't build accurate atmospheric models without good baseline measurements." Briggs had been observing the valley through his spotting scope, the tripod allowing him to maintain steady observation despite his tremors. "Then we do it old school. My eyes, your brain, we've done it before." Sarah pulled out her notebook, ready to translate Briggs's observations into calculations. "Okay, talk me through what you're seeing." "Heat shimmers already severe," Briggs said, his voice steady despite the physical struggle evident in his posture. "Mirage boiling at ground level. That tells me temperature gradient is extreme. Hot air at surface, cooler air at altitude. Bullets going to rise through the hot layer." Sarah wrote notes, building mental models. "How much rise?" "More than your ballistic computer will predict," Briggs said. "See that dust devil forming at 1,200 meters? Means strong convection current, rising air. Your bullet hits that, it's going up whether you want it to or not." They spent the next hour mapping the valley together. Sarah asking questions, Briggs providing observations that decades of experience made meaningful. Wind patterns, thermal layers, pressure gradients visible only to someone who knew what to look for. But Sarah could see the toll it was taking on Briggs. His breathing was labored. His hands shook worse as fatigue set in. His voice, normally strong, carried a rasp that suggested lungs struggling to provide oxygen. "Gunny, you need to rest," Sarah said during a lull in observations. "I'll rest when Webb is safe," Briggs replied. But then he had a coughing fit that lasted 30 seconds and left him pale and shaking. One of the SEAL security personnel, a young petty officer named Martinez, moved closer. "Gunnery Sergeant, we've got medical supplies. Something we can do?" Briggs waved him off. "Just old lungs giving me trouble. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Sarah could see it. The cancer, the treatments, the years, all combining to overwhelm a body that had already given more than most bodies could give. Briggs was here through sheer force of will, but will alone couldn't overcome cellular failure. Cross checked in via radio. "Shooting element, what's your status?" Sarah keyed her mic. "Position established. Atmospheric mapping in progress. But we're encountering challenges with environmental conditions." "Define challenges," Cross said, his tone suggesting he needed honest assessment, not optimistic reassurance. Sarah looked at Briggs, then made a decision. "Instruments are failing in extreme heat. We're relying on observational methods, and Gunny's health is becoming a factor. He can still read the valley, but physical limitations are affecting his ability to maintain extended observation." There was a pause on the radio, then Cross said, "Can you make the shot?" Sarah thought about Webb, about his 3 kids, about the promise she'd made to herself that her students would come home, about the partnership she and Briggs had built that had already accomplished impossible things. "Yes," she said, "we can make the shot." "Then make it," Cross said. "We're standing by." 2 hours before the scheduled breach, Briggs's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the spotting scope. Even with the tripod support, maintaining steady observation was becoming impossible. Sarah watched as he tried to focus, tried to read atmospheric conditions, tried to be the spotter he had always been. but his body was failing him in ways that Will couldn't overcome. "Gunny," Sarah said quietly, "we need to talk." Briggs looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something that might have been defeat in his eyes. "I can't hold it steady anymore. The shaking's too bad. I'm letting you down." "You're not letting me down," Sarah said firmly. "You're human. You're 82 years old with stage 4 cancer. The fact that you're here at all is testament to your dedication. But we need to adapt." "How?" Briggs asked. "You need someone spotting, someone reading conditions in real time." "I need your knowledge," Sarah said, "not necessarily your hands. What if we reverse roles? I observe through the scope. You tell me what to look for. I become your hands and eyes. You become my brain and experience. Like we did during the mortar attack, but more deliberate." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see the struggle in his face, the old warrior being forced to accept that he couldn't do what he'd always done, that his contribution had to change shape to remain valuable. "That means you can't shoot," Briggs said finally. "It means I shoot after you teach me how to see what you see," Sarah replied. "Gunny, you've spent 55 years learning to read atmospheric conditions. That knowledge doesn't disappear because your hands shake. But I need you to transfer it. Teach me, right now, everything you know about reading this specific valley." "We've got 2 hours," Briggs said. "Then we use every minute of those 2 hours," Sarah said. "You've taught hundreds of people over the years. Teach me now. Teach me like Webb's life depends on it, because it does." Briggs looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not defeat anymore. Purpose. One last mission. One last student. One last chance to pass on knowledge before time ran out. "Okay," he said. "Get it on the spotting scope. I'll walk you through what you need to see." For the next 90 minutes, Gunny Briggs conducted a masterclass in atmospheric observation. He sat beside Sarah while she observed through the scope, his raspy voice describing patterns that eyes could see, but computers couldn't measure. "See those trees at 800 meters? Watch the leaves, not just that they're moving, but how they're moving. See the flutter pattern? That's turbulent air. Means winds hitting an obstacle and breaking up. Your bullet goes through there, it's going to get pushed unpredictably. You need to account for that." Sarah watched, learning to see patterns she'd always understood mathematically but never observed directly. "Now look at the compound walls. See how the heat shimmer is worse on the south-facing side? That's solar loading. Stone absorbing heat, creating strong thermal currents. Air rising fast there. That affects bullet trajectory in the final 100 meters." Briggs continued, painting a picture of the valley not as static terrain, but as a living system. Air moving, heating, cooling, interacting with itself in ways that created the chaos that defeated conventional shooting solutions. "The key," Briggs said, his voice growing weaker but no less focused, "is not trying to measure everything precisely. It's recognizing patterns. When you see this combination of conditions, you know air is doing this. When you see that combination, you know something different is happening. It's pattern recognition built through observation. That's what I've spent 50 years developing. Now you need to compress it into 90 minutes." Sarah absorbed everything, asking questions, confirming observations, building understanding that integrated her theoretical knowledge with Briggs's practical wisdom. It was the partnership at its purest. Science and art, calculation and intuition, youth and age, each incomplete alone but powerful together. "Time check," Martinez called out. 30 minutes to breach." Sarah and Briggs had finished their preparation. Sarah had observed the valley, learned its patterns, integrated Briggs's wisdom with her own calculations. Now came the moment of truth, the shot that would either save Webb or doom him. Sarah settled into shooting position. The rifle came up to her shoulder with familiar comfort. 10 years of practice, thousands of shots, but never one that mattered this much. Briggs positioned himself beside her, unable to look through a scope, but able to observe with naked eye and relay information based on what he saw. "Target is the guard in the North Tower," Cross said over the radio. "When he drops, we breach. Timing is critical. We need to be inside the compound before other guards can react." Sarah acquired the target through her scope, a man in the tower, 2,647 meters away, unaware that his life was measured in seconds. She felt the familiar conflict, taking a life, ending someone's existence, but also saving Webb, saving 3 other hostages, completing the mission. Wind check, Sarah said quietly. Briggs observed the valley. Trees at 600 say left to right, moderate. Trees at 1400 say right to left, stronger. You've got multiple wind layers. It's going to push your bullet left, then right, then left again. Sarah adjusted her scope, incorporating Briggs's wind call with her own understanding of how bullet trajectory would interact with those patterns. Thermal check, Sarah said. Shimmer is severe between 1200 and 1800 meters, Briggs said. Strong rising air. Your bullet's going to climb through that section. Compensate down or you'll miss high. Sarah adjusted elevation, trusting the old Marine's read, even though it contradicted what her ballistic computer suggested. 20 minutes to breach, Cross said over the radio. Sarah slowed her breathing, entering the mental state that made precision possible. The world narrowed to scope picture, wind call, and the mathematical certainty that she could put a bullet exactly where it needed to go. But doubt whispered in the back of her mind. 2,647 meters, conditions that had defeated 43 previous attempts. Her father's voice, forever in her head. Too soft, can't handle the pressure. Doc, Briggs said quietly beside her. His voice carried something beyond tactical information. Something personal. I'm not going to make it much longer. Cancer's winning. Doctors give me maybe 3 months. This is probably my last mission. Sarah turned to look at him, startled by the sudden admission. I need you to know something, Briggs continued. These 4 years teaching with you have been the best of my life. Not the combat, not the confirmed kills, not the medals or the recognition. Teaching you, watching you grow from someone who understood theory to someone who embodies the integration we built together. That's my legacy. Not the 247 kills, not the 50 years of service. You, the program, the students we trained, that's what matters. Gunny, you're going to beat this, Sarah said, though they both knew it was a comforting lie. I'm not, but that's okay. I've had a good run, longer than most, better than many. Briggs looked at her directly. Your father was wrong about you. You're not too soft. You're exactly strong enough to care and still do the hard thing. Strong enough to teach warriors while maintaining your humanity. Strong enough to take this shot even though you're scared. That's real strength. I wish he could have seen it, but I've seen it, and I'm proud of what you've become. Sarah felt tears threatening, but forced them back. You taught me half of what I know. You taught me the other half, Briggs replied. That's what partnership means. Now take the shot, save Webb, complete the mission, show everyone that the old Marine and the scientist built something that works. Sarah returned to her scope, emotions channeled into focus. Briggs's words settled into her bones, giving her certainty she hadn't felt moments before. 10 minutes to breach, Cross said. Sarah observed atmospheric conditions, seeing what Briggs had taught her to see. The patterns, the rhythms, the living breath of the valley revealing itself to someone who knew how to read it. Wind is stabilizing, Sarah said. Thermal layer at 1400 is settling. I've got a window opening. How long? Briggs asked. Maybe 5 minutes. Then conditions shift and we're back to chaos. Then we take it now, Briggs said. Webb can't wait for perfect. He needs good enough executed right now. Sarah keyed her radio. Cross, I'm taking the shot early. Atmospheric window opening now. Be ready to breach on my impact. There was a pause. Then Cross said, understood. Breach team standing by. Send it when ready. Sarah did the final calculations in her head. Wind left to right, then right to left, then left again. Thermal rise between 12 and 1800 meters. Temperature differential creating density gradient. Coriolis effect at this latitude and distance. All the factors integrating into a single shooting solution that existed only in her mind. Range 2647, Sarah said quietly. Confirmed, Briggs replied. Wind multiple layers. Net value approximately 3 miles per hour right to left. Confirmed. That's what I'm seeing. Thermal rise significant through middle section. Compensating down 0.7 mils. That's right, Briggs said. Trust your read. Sarah settled into perfect stillness. Breathing imperceptible. Heartbeat steady. Body mechanics refined through 10,000 hours of practice. The rifle an extension of her consciousness rather than a separate tool. She thought about Webb, about his kids who deserved their father, about the promise she'd made to herself that her students would come home, about Briggs beside her, fighting cancer to be here, giving everything he had left to make this mission succeed, about her father, Colonel James Hendricks, who thought she was too soft but would never know he was wrong. The moment arrived. Not when conditions were perfect, because perfect didn't exist at this range, but when conditions aligned well enough for skill to bridge the gap between probable and certain. Sarah fired. The TAC-50 roared. Recoil massive but controlled. The bullet left the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second, beginning its 8.7-second journey through atmosphere that wanted to defeat it. At 1 second, the bullet traveled through their immediate elevation, wind pushing it left. Sarah had compensated right. At 2.3 seconds, it entered the thermal layer, rising air lifting the bullet higher than standard ballistics predicted. Sarah had compensated down. At 4.1 seconds, crosswind from the opposite direction pushed the bullet back right. Sarah's calculations had predicted this, incorporating Briggs' observation of how wind behaved at that specific distance. At 6.4 seconds, the bullet descended through the final stretch, fighting wind that swirled around compound walls affected by heat rising from stone and the complex aerodynamics of buildings creating turbulence. At 8.7 seconds, the bullet arrived. Sarah watched through her scope. The guard in the tower collapsed. Clean hit, instant effect. "Target down," Sarah said into the radio. "Execute breach." "Breach in progress," Cross replied. Then the sound of explosions as breaching charges blew doors. Gunfire, shouting, the controlled chaos of close-quarters battle conducted by professionals who trained for exactly this scenario. Sarah stayed on scope, observing, ready to take follow-up shots if needed. But the breach went as planned. Seals flowing through openings, suppressing resistance, securing hostages. "Hostages located," Cross said over the radio. 4 souls, all alive. Exfil in progress. Relief flooded through Sarah like a physical wave. Webb was alive. The mission was successful. The impossible shot had been possible after all. Beside her, Briggs was breathing hard, the exertion of the past hours overwhelming his compromised system. But he was smiling, actually smiling. "You did it, Doc. Hell of a shot." "We did it," Sarah corrected. "Your read made it possible." "Your skill executed it," Briggs replied. "That's the partnership. That's what we built." Exfiltration went smoothly. Hostages extracted. Team withdrawn. By the time the sun was fully above the horizon, they were back at the forward operating base, conducting the immediate debrief that followed all combat operations. Webb looked rough, beaten, dehydrated, but alive and conscious and already demanding to know who'd made the shot that saved him. Cross brought Webb to the briefing room where Sarah and Briggs were providing their mission report. Webb saw his former instructors and something broke in his composure. The hardened SEAL who'd been captured and beaten showed the emotion he had been suppressing. "You too," Webb said, his voice rough from dehydration and trauma. "You came for me." "Of course we came for you," Sarah said. "You're ours, our student, our responsibility. We weren't going to leave you there." Webb moved forward and embraced Sarah in a hug that was probably against regulations, but nobody cared about regulations at that moment. Then he moved to Briggs, more careful because the old Marine looked fragile, but the embrace was no less meaningful. "Gunny, you shouldn't be here," Webb said. "You're not well enough for this." "Wasn't going to let some punk kids do this without adult supervision," Briggs said with his trademark gruff humor. But his breathing was labored and his color was wrong. "Gunny needs medical attention," Sarah said to Cross. "Already arranged," Cross replied. "C-17 back to Djibouti in 2 hours, then medical flight back to the States." Briggs waved them off. "I'm fine, just tired." But he wasn't fine. Over the next hours, as they prepared for the flight home, Briggs's condition deteriorated. The exertion of the mission, the stress, the cancer that was winning, all combining to overwhelm whatever reserves he'd been running on. By the time they loaded onto the C-17, Briggs needed assistance walking. By the time they were airborne, he needed oxygen. Medical personnel on board did what they could, but cancer didn't care about medical intervention at this stage. Sarah sat beside Briggs' stretcher as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude. The old Marine looked small, diminished, his robust warrior's body consumed by disease. "Doc," Briggs said quietly, his voice barely audible over aircraft noise. "Listen to me. Save your strength, Gunny." "Strength for what? I'm done, we both know it." Briggs managed a weak smile. "But I got to finish on my own terms. One last mission, one last impossible shot, one last time proving that the partnership works. That's a good ending." "It's not an ending," Sarah said, tears finally falling. "You're going to fight this. You're going to beat it." "Sarah," Briggs said, using her first name for perhaps the 3rd time in 4 years, "I don't want to beat it. I'm tired. I've been fighting for 82 years, 55 years in uniform, 5 wars, 247 men killed, more injuries than I can count, more pain than anyone should carry. I'm ready to rest. But the program, Sarah said, the students, we need you. The program doesn't need me anymore, Briggs said. It needs you. You've got Webb and Morrison and Kane to help. You've got a dozen others who understand the methodology well enough to teach it. My part is done. I got to finish the way I wanted. Teaching, serving, making one last impossible shot with the best partner I ever had. That's enough. Sarah held the old Marine's hand, feeling how cold it was despite the warm aircraft cabin. You changed my life. Changed how I see everything. Changed what I thought was possible. You changed mine too, Briggs whispered. Showed this old dog that new science and old wisdom aren't enemies. That the future isn't about choosing one approach over another. That the best solutions come from people willing to bridge gaps instead of defending territories. That's your legacy now. Carry it forward. I promise, Sarah said. Briggs closed his eyes, exhaustion overwhelming him. Tell my sister I went out doing what I loved. Tell the students to keep learning. Tell them Gunny said the impossible is just physics people don't understand yet. Tell them yourself, Sarah said, when you wake up. But Briggs didn't wake up. Not in any meaningful way. The flight back to the States, the transfer to Walter Reed Medical Center, the final days in hospice care surrounded by the few family members he had left and the many students who'd learned from him over the decades. Sarah was there when he died, sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, present for the moment when breath simply stopped and the warrior who'd spent 82 years fighting finally laid down his burden. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Hundreds attended. SEALs, Marines, Army Special Forces, students from 5 decades of service. The quiet professionals who rarely gathered in public, making an exception for one of their own. Sarah delivered the eulogy because Briggs had requested it specifically. She stood before the assembled warriors, looking at their faces, seeing respect and grief in equal measure. Gunnery Sergeant William Briggs lived 82 years, Sarah began. He served in uniform for 55 of them. He made confirmed kills in 5 different wars across 6 decades. He earned decorations that remain classified and respect that was universal. But numbers don't capture who he was. She paused, gathering herself. Gunny taught me that wind isn't data. It's a living thing that must be read, understood, respected. He taught me that technology enhances experience but doesn't replace it. He taught me that the best solutions come from integrating different approaches rather than defending single methodologies. He taught me that caring deeply about outcomes doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. Sarah looked at the flag-draped coffin. 4 years ago, Gunny and I built something together, a training program that married cutting-edge science with traditional fieldcraft. We trained dozens of warriors who can now make shots that conventional wisdom says are impossible. That program will continue. Those students will teach others. And Gunny's knowledge, his wisdom, his approach to understanding atmosphere and terrain will live on through everyone he influenced. She finished with words Briggs had said to her, "The impossible is just physics. People don't understand yet." Gunny understood. He taught us to understand. And that understanding will save lives for generations to come. That's legacy. That's immortality. That's what Gunnery Sergeant William Briggs gave us. And we will honor it by continuing the work he started. 18 months later, Sarah stood at the dedication ceremony for the newly renamed facility. The Naval Special Warfare Training Center building that housed the Advanced Marksmanship Program now bore a plaque, the Briggs Hendricks Center for Advanced Marksmanship. Webb, now a lieutenant and fully recovered from his captivity, gave the dedication speech to an audience that included senior command, instructors, and students past and present. The 2 people this building honors represent something rare in modern warfare, Webb said. The perfect marriage of science and art, calculation and instinct, new generation and old guard. Dr. Sarah Hendricks taught us that atmosphere is a puzzle that can be solved. Gunnery Sergeant William Briggs taught us that wind is alive, and to solve it, you must live with it. Together they taught us that neither method alone is enough, but combined they make the impossible possible. Sarah listened from the front row, feeling the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction of purpose. The program had trained 84 students over 6 years. Those students had made shots in combat that saved lives, completed missions, changed outcomes. The methodology worked. The integration of science and fieldcraft created capability that neither approach achieved alone. After the ceremony, Sarah walked alone to the range where she and Briggs had first worked together, where they discovered that partnership transcended methodology, where they'd built something that would outlive them both. She thought about her father, Colonel James Hendricks, who'd thought she was too soft, who died believing she couldn't handle the warrior life. She'd never gotten to prove him wrong directly, but she'd proven him wrong through her work, through her students, through a program that would save lives for decades to come. "I made it, Dad," Sarah said quietly to the empty range. "Not the way you expected, not following the path you wanted, but I made it, and I think Gunny would say that counts for something." The wind moved across the valley, carrying the familiar patterns that Sarah had learned to read: temperature and pressure, and the infinite complexity of air and motion. She could see it now, not just calculate it, not just measure it, but truly see it the way Briggs had seen it: science and intuition unified into understanding that existed beyond either discipline alone. Her phone buzzed, text from Webb: "Got 15 new students arriving next week. You ready?" Sarah smiled and typed back, "Ready. Let's teach them something worth knowing." Because that's what legacy meant. Not resting on past achievements, not memorializing what was done, but continuing the work, teaching the next generation, pushing boundaries further, making the impossible not just possible, but repeatable, teachable, sustainable. Gunny Briggs had taught her that in the Balkans, at Bridgeport, in Yemen, and in his final days when he'd shown her that finishing well mattered more than lasting forever. Sarah walked back toward the training facility, ready to teach another generation of warriors to read the wind, understand the atmosphere, make shots that combine science and art into precision that saved lives. The work continued. The mission endured. And in a building that bore both their names, the partnership between a Marine legend and a scientist who'd had something to prove lived on through every student who learned that the impossible was just physics waiting to be understood. The wind still blew through the valley, but now there were warriors who could read it, predict it, and use it to achieve what others thought impossible. That was the legacy. That was the victory. That was what Gunnery Sergeant William Briggs and Dr. Sarah Hendricks had built together. And it would endure long after both of them were gone. Teaching, learning, growing, one shot at a time, one student at a time, one impossible mission made possible through the understanding that neither old wisdom nor new science was complete alone. But together they changed everything.